The European Union stands at the crossroads of global instability. We've become a world without borders, Mr. Speaker, at least in the sense of the globalized nature of international finance and the international economy. You want to talk about breaking up the EU? Think of what the breakup of Yugoslavia meant in 1993, except now on a continent-wide scale, and because of the nature of today's finance, on a global scale. And you know what's hilarious? None of us recognize the danger that's beholden to such a breakup. All of us, of all continents, but most especially the people of Europe standing at ground zero, maintain the fatal conceit beholden to the outmoded nation-state paradigm of the past. We live in a world of deeply interconnected global economies, yet operate from the mindset that our economy ends at our borders. Mr. Speaker, I hate to employ a historical parallel so severe, but we are like those entrenched soldiers on the Western Front in 1914, innocently peeking our heads over the top, bemused by what may befall us in that wide unknown that is no man's land. We know what happened to those soldiers, and the analogy remains remarkably salient for Europe today. There is no middle-of-the-road option for the European Union. And we can see because that's what we've been doing. The leaders of the European Central Bank, the AAA leaders of Europe, or should I say even bold propositions like the Stability and Growth Act, all have either refused to impose the necessary safeguards for flailing economies, or failed to hold cheating economies to account. The continent has been struck dumb, crouching in a small and rapidly diminishing patch of tall grass in the middle of no man's land. Now, Mr. Speaker, we've reached the point where there can be no more kicking the can down the road, and I hope that's a point that will unite both the affirmative and the negative in tonight's debate. Either we go over the top, or we hold our ground. If we choose to dissolve the European Union, our leaders maintain the fatal conceit, as those generals once did, that we can make it across the wide expanse of no man's land, leading us to either be gunned down by forces beyond our time, or to gun down our fellow brothers. But there is still time. We don't have to go over the top. We can play a game of kickball in the grass, as those soldiers so audaciously did in December 1914 with the famous Christmas truce. Because while we may maintain our key national distinctions, while we may hold our distinct identities, we are brothers in a common cause to fight off this economic malaise that has gripped the continent of Europe. We are not a people. We are not a humanity that finds it okay to dress up Angela Merkel in Nazi garb. We are not a people who say it's okay to portray all Greeks as lazy sloths sitting on the beach, wasting away their retirement income. These are false ways of looking at the situation before us. They kindle national animosity, and that is incredibly dangerous and irresponsible to humanity, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I argue for option two. I argue not only that we must preserve the European Union, but that we must integrate even more deeply. Not to the tune of the United States of Europe, as the previous negative said, but simply so as to create the critical central institutions to restore confidence and credibility to the global economy. Now, Mr. Fisher outlined a vision for what he sees as a proper model of Europe. But I'm afraid that Mr. Fisher's vision is living in an economic fantasy land. Let's take a look at what the European Union has done for the economies of Greater Europe. How's the currency doing? Well, the euro's pretty strong. It's not beating the pound, granted, but it's doing pretty well against the dollar. How about debt? Well, if you take a look at GDP to debt ratios, Spain is actually doing much better than Britain, and yet is facing far deeper and more pernicious interest rates because of it. This doesn't make much sense either. So what about economic gains? Well, with all due respect to what the previous speaker said, enlargement has created growth and wealth all over Europe. The export GDP of Britain went from 2.2 billion pounds in 1993 to 10 billion pounds in 2011. In Germany, from 15 billion euros to 95. In France, from 2.7 to 16. These are not paltry gains, and they are all equally accountable because of the European Union and the framework that it engenders for all European economies. So why did Greece go under? Well, Greece was profligate. These are very simple answers. and they require very simple solutions. We need a tighter European central bank that can help to boost flailing economies, or nations like Spain that are being adversely affected when they are keeping pretty responsible internally, yet suffering from 25% and approaching the point of militant, indignado-based hatred against their central government. We need a stronger European Commission. We need regulations like the six-pack regulations proposed by Poland that hold nations in Europe all to account. Because let me tell you something. It wasn't just Greece that broke the Stability and Growth Pact. It was also Germany. It was also Britain. It was also France. That pact has been violated 60 times, and to hold one nation to accountability and no others is criminal. I want to finish tonight with what Radoslaw Slawowski, the Polish foreign minister, said as he contemplated this crisis last November 2011. I fear German power less than I am beginning to fear German inactivity. I couldn't imagine a statement more ensconced in humanity, a statement of a deeper brotherhood, a statement that represents that common cause any better than what he said. And we should all bear it in mind tonight. I yield to questions.
Questions for Mr. Crawford?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So I'm totally unconvinced by this analogy that Mr. Crawford did in the beginning. Can he please, elaborate on what exactly, what world-shattering conflict plus, ethnic cleansing plus genocide will take place if the EU dissolves? Because that was the analogy he drew. Because the only way, and this analogy makes sense, is that World War I was preceded by the greatest economic integration that Europe had seen up to that point.
Well, history, Mr. Wadlington, never reproduces itself exactly. That's why it's called an analogy. So, no, we're not going to see mayhem. We're not going to see genocide on the scale of what Nazi Germany performed. But we could see not just Greece default, but multiple nations default. We could see Spain stuck around 20 to 25% unemployment and growing through the duration of the 21st century. These are not paltry things. These are not silly little consequences of irresponsibility. These are fundamental systematic institutional consequences. And the solutions that Mr. Fisher outlined are far from significant. This is far more significant than a matter of public opinion or democracy. People don't like the European Union because it's good for politicians to pander to hatred, to ethnic tension, to nationalism. That's why we see the kind of disdainful public opinion that we see today. It doesn't have to be the case. Above all, we need political leadership in Europe that advocates for these more collective policies to restore flailing economies.
For perhaps a final question, Mr. Jacobson. Thank you for your going, Mr. Speaker. So Mr. Crawford paints a pretty apocalyptic picture, and I wonder if it's really that bad, Greece and Spain and Poland default. And if perhaps the benefits of continuing to be sovereign nations might outweigh that drawback.
They are sovereign nations. Yes, they are. They maintain their same basic taxes. They maintain the same VAT taxes that they've always done. They can still coordinate an economic policy. They still elect their own leaders. I mean, we're not going to create a United States of Europe. That's not feasible. We have to acknowledge the fundamental national, cultural, and ethnic distinctions. I mean, language is one critical aspect of this. You don't see different languages spoken in every state in the United States of America. You do see different languages spoken all through Europe. But, you know what? It was a pretty simple thing for those generals to realize that it wasn't too smart to go over the top and run into incoming machine gun fire. And we still did it anyway to the tune of tens of millions of soldiers who died. This is that same fatal conceit, and it must be defeated.